All right, so we don't do this a lot, but we want to step outside of the SEC for one game, and it's partly because we know a little bit about this team already, and we don't like to talk about teams that we don't know a whole lot about because it's impossible to have in-depth knowledge about all the teams in college football. It's just, you can look at box scores or whatever, but unless you actually watch the film, watch them play, and do your research, you shouldn't speak on it unless you're paid to, and we're not. So, and those two teams this week are Clemson and Louisville. Again, we usually stay in the SEC, but there's not a lot of great games in the SEC this week. So we want to touch on one of those big games. Clemson is a team we researched heavily last week for the Auburn game. We both picked Clemson in that game, expecting to pick Auburn. Ended up going with Clemson, and I think we got pretty close on the margin as well. You picked a real low-scoring game. To your credit, you were even more right than I was. Louisville has had some weirdness to start out the season. We expected some slow getting things together on the Clemson side for the offense. Knew their defense was going to be great. Louisville struggled in their opener and then looked kind of just out of sorts getting going. Put it away at the end last week against North Carolina, but still didn't look amazing coming into this game. So why don't you get us started on two teams that most SEC fans may not know a whole lot about at this point in the season, and kind of get this game teed up, Clemson and Louisville.
Right. Well, I'll start with Louisville and touch on them, go to Clemson. We'll just move back into it. The most of what a lot of people know about Louisville right now is to beat North Carolina in a game last week, 47-35, close game. Kind of pulled away late. It was real tight at the half. And I think the thing that has to be noted there, and we talk about it early in the year, expectations are really out of whack, and we don't know what any team is relative to another. The big example, we like to joke about is Notre Dame beating Texas the opener. What was it, last year? And everybody goes crazy because look, Notre Dame's back and Texas is back, and oh my gosh, it was a great game. Turns out they were both completely and utterly terrible, and the defenses were just gutter trash. And that's why that game was what it was. North Carolina lost to Louisville, but they lost to Cal the week before, 35-30. And Cal is not expected to be really any good. So there's a pretty good chance North Carolina is not a good team. Obviously, they lost Mitchell Trubisky, however you want to say it, to the Bears this year. And I don't know. I mean, as you said, Louisville has looked out of sorts in their two games. I don't know what to think of it. We've talked about it a lot. We had a whole article and discussion last year, and you can pull that up, where we really got down and dirty with the fact that Petrino's scheme is very inconsistent. He throws so many deep passes, and they have so stinking many drives that they put a ton of points on the board, and it sort of deceives you from how effective they are in a given series. I say that because I think one game last year they had 15 possessions or in the first half. I think that was like the Syracuse game. They put up like 50 points and a half. It's like, yeah, but they had 15 possessions. It's more than most teams have, or a lot of teams are going to have in a game. And that's kind of what Petrino does, because they're going to throw the ball deep and they're going to go 3 and out, or they're going to have 6 plays and score. But he's more than happy just punting over and over again. And right now, they're on the low end of that inconsistency streak. Barely held off Purdue. At one point, it looked like they were going to lose that game because they were actually down 20. Well, they were up. I guess what was it, like 25-21 the third quarter? I think Purdue scored then to maybe actually take the lead, and that ended up being a 1-touchdown victory for them. So I think there's sort of two sides to that. One, Louisville lost a lot of skill position talent at receiver and at running back. That's kind of put them behind the 8 ball. The offensive line does not look any better. They had a lot of turnover. Matter of fact, they may well actually be worse. I don't think people are giving that enough credit. And defensively, they lost a lot of impact players. So just across the board, Louisville had a lot of losses from a team that probably overachieved the year before. And as much as they overachieved, they also underachieved against several teams. So, now that we've said all that, flip over to Clemson. Last week I predicted Clemson would beat Auburn 24-10. I said that was a low scoring game, and both of us flipped our pick in that game primarily due to the fact that we watched Auburn against Georgia Southern, and both of us flagged the offensive line as being a major point of weakness. Took some flack on that in our preview, I think, from Auburn fans, but I didn't think I thought there were signs that the offensive tackles, even though they didn't give up sacks, were a serious problem in that Georgia Southern game. There was just too much pressure. It sounded weird at the time. 11 sacks later, I think it actually makes some pretty good sense. So Clemson, I think, is a lot more proven, obviously, than Louisville. They've played, we've already been over the fact that I think that Kent State in the opener was such a piece of paper that they were running through that I don't think you can take anything from it whatsoever. But the Auburn game, I think, does give us some signs. I think Bryant can throw the ball pretty well. I'm not Neither one of us are sold necessarily in Auburn's secondary well enough to judge the passing game, but he put the ball accurately down the field enough for me to feel like the passing game is serviceable. But he's a very good runner. I think the offensive line yet again is pretty solid. I think they have good running backs. With the fact they have a dual threat helps everything there. And then defensively, and I think this is going to be the story of the game. And I'll let you sort of chime in just a second. But I think defensively, the front seven of Clemson is as good or better than anybody else in the country. And that, to me, is the key when you're facing Lamar Jackson and Louisville.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I'm not convinced Louisville has a defense, and that's probably not fair. It's tough because we talk about this notion of if you are going to be considered among the elites or good enough to beat an elite, then you got to be a lot better than the crappy teams on your schedule. And I don't think North Carolina's a crappy team, but they're not great. They gave up, 35 to Cal in a loss. And Purdue is, I think, improved over being historically the last few years a dumpster fire, but I don't think they're good. And they gave Louisville everything they wanted. And some of that was probably just rust and taking a while for them to get going. And we see that Louisville can score when they need to. They almost like they can turn it on when they need to. But what they haven't done is face a team that can play defense. And what Clemson, if you look at Clemson and consider Auburn a struggle, because I think it was, it's because they faced a really good defense. And I think if, they put up 14 points against Auburn, had a decent amount of yards, a little more yards than the 14 points would reflect, but that's a really good defense in Auburn. There's a lot of talent on that defense, and they're really well coached, and they stymied Clemson last year. I don't think Louisville has that same anywhere close to that on defense. Now, granted, they're a lot better offensively than Auburn, but I'll go back to what I always say. Offense comes and goes. Defense is generally there week to week. You can count on defense a whole lot more than you can count on needing to beat everybody 37-35, 42-38. And so far in this season, Louisville's needed at minimum 29 points to win the first game and 36 points to win the second game. I could see them giving up that kind of run to Clemson, but not being able to hang with them in a track meet because they're facing so much resistance on the other side.
Yeah, no, I buy that. And, one thing Louisville was very good at last year is they were very good in rush defense. Okay. I mean, they were like, for the most part, 24th nationally, a solid rush defense. They had some games where they gave up a ton of yards. But they held about half their opponents under 100 yards. And so far this year, they've done great. I mean, they gave up only 51 yards rushing to Purdue. They only gave up 17 to North Carolina. Why do I say all that? Because one of the few teams that could run the ball on them was Clemson. Clemson ran for over 200 yards last year. And if you want to figure out who else ran the ball well, okay, well, Clemson ran it for 200. Kentucky ran it for 230. They lost. LSU ran it for 177. They lost. So 3 of the 4 losses that they suffered last year were 3 of the 4 teams that passed for the most yardage. And the only other loss they had was the Houston game, and that had less to do with what they did on defense and more to do with only scoring 10 points. So I think, like you said, the defensive issues for Louisville are a problem because, like I said early on, and it's the reason I pointed this out, they score a lot of points when they get a lot of drives, and their offense is designed to kind of get rhythm and get momentum, and they lean on you, and they start scoring quickly, put a lot of pressure for your offense, and teams tend to crack. But if you can hang on to the ball and sustain drives and put pressure on them where they have to respond, and they've been sitting on the sideline for 5 minutes, now they've got to throw the ball 40 yards down the field. It's I don't know. It's hard to describe, but it kind of screws with the rhythm and the psyche of the team. As much as I hate to be the person to say all that, and they lost just. I mean, they just lost a lot of talent from the guys that made all those tackles last year. The that part of the team, and I get the fact that they've done pretty well so far this year, but I don't know. It's
offensively.
yeah, offensively. Well, and I was gonna say defensively in rush defense, they've been very good. But there's a lot of, well, you're going to have to show me here because they lose their leading tackler in Kelsey, and they lose Josh Harvey Clemens in the secondary. And I don't know. I'm just not sold that they really are stout enough to hold up in the run game, especially when Clemson is much more of a running quarterback situation. That they're going to be able to keep Clemson from keeping them off the field. And if they do that, and Lamar Jackson comes in, and that Clemson defense can stay fresh, man, Wilkins, Farrell, and Lawrence are a heck of a trio on the defensive line. I mean, the other guys like Brian and Joseph and Daniel aren't bad, but those three are just a terror. And if there's one thing we learned at the end of the season, like the Houston game and the LSU game, if you've got first round talent rushing the passer against Lamar Jackson, where he can't set his feet and he can't just run away from you in the pocket, that things can go south for Louisville pretty quick. So that's my big concern in this ball game.
A skeptic would point to all the things that you are saying and that I'm saying and say, well, wait a minute. Louisville scored some points on Clemson last year, and isn't Auburn's offense terrible because they couldn't score last year and they couldn't score in this game in Clemson? Are we giving Clemson's defense too much credit, or is Auburn's offense better than we think it is and Clemson really did stymie a decent attack?
My guess, and it is too early to tell, right? And this is when we talk about, we do statistics and run models, but it takes about 4 weeks of data for us to do that. But at the moment, from what I saw, I didn't think Clemson's secondary actually did a great job in coverage. Something we talked about in the Clemson game. There was one point late in that game, I think it was the third quarter, and everybody's ragging on Stidham, but Auburn had 7 guys in max protect blocking for Stidham. Okay, 7 dudes with a quarterback that's 8 guys there that are blocking or throwing the football, and that only leaves you with 3 receivers. Clemson brought 4 people and got pressure. So that means Clemson brought 4 defenders to get pressure and dropped 7 in coverage to cover 3 receivers. If I can double team every receiver on the field and have a safety to spare, my pass coverage is going to look pretty darn good. But a lot of that was resulted from the fact that I think Auburn's offensive line was a serious weakness, and Clemson was built extremely well to exploit that fact. That's why we flipped our pick. Um, I don't think most teams are going to have the issues at offensive line that Auburn had in that game, and everything kind of cascaded from there. But I think there will come a point where Clemson's secondary, when they're going to face somebody with an offensive line that forces their secondary to play honest. They've lost a lot of pieces from the secondary, and there were signs early in that game when Auburn moved the ball well, where they had more man coverage and more one-on-one matchups, that Auburn was beating Clemson through the air. And that really only stopped when Clemson realized they didn't need to blitz and they just needed to bring 4 and drop a million guys into coverage and not give them any windows to throw the ball. When Clemson actually faces somebody that can really throw the ball like that and protect the passer well enough to make them play one-on-one, I think they may get exposed a little bit. The concern here is not that Lamar Jackson can't throw those balls, because I think he can. The concern is I don't think Louisville is going to be any better at protecting Lamar Jackson than Auburn. And there may be a couple plays where he can scramble and generate something with his legs and buy time to throw the ball down the field. but that's asking a lot to do that on any sort of consistent basis. So I don't know that basically, I don't know that Louisville's going to have the pass protection to give their receivers time to exploit the Clemson secondary. Because I do think Clemson, I think in the front seven, Clemson's about as good as anyone, and particularly I think defensive line. I'm not sold 100% on the linebackers, frankly. I'm not sold 100% on the corners or safeties. I think they're good. I don't know that they're elite, but the defensive line is elite, and it's the story of college football. If when you're playing a team with an elite defensive line, you have to be able to do block them just well enough for anything else to matter. To get the ball, Leonard Fournette to actually get him out of the backfield, or if you're playing in your Texas A&M, right? You've got to have enough time for whatever revolving door quarterback you have to actually be able to throw the ball down the field. And when you don't have that time, everything breaks down. And I think that's going to be kind of Clemson all year. There's going to be a certain point where that lead line can't take over, and all of a sudden they may look really vulnerable really fast.
All right, we don't have a computer model for this game, and I don't quite want you to give us. I don't want you to give me your score quite yet. I want to do something a little interesting on this game. You'll give me your score for Clemson in a second, and maybe that can be part of this right now. But what I would like to hear from you is, what does the score look like in this game if Clemson wins, and what does the score look like in this game if Louisville wins?
I think if Clemson wins this game, I think they're going to have to kind of slow down Lamar Jackson, and it's going to be because they can run the ball. So I think that's probably going to look like probably something like a 34-17 kind of game. And if Louisville wins the game, it's going to be that they're clicking, they're getting the ball a lot, and they're throwing it down the field because I think Clemson's going to score. So if Louisville wins the game, they're going to outscore Clemson. And all of a sudden, I think this looks like a 47-41 game if Louisville wins it.
All right, next question. If Louisville wins the game, is the MVP going to be Lamar Jackson? And if Clemson wins the game, who's the MVP?
Well, I think Louisville, it's going to be Lamar Jackson because, to be honest, it's a little bit unfair. Their offense just means he touches the ball in every play. He's a phenomenal player, but he's going to get every yard they get pretty much. But if Clemson wins the game, personally, I think if they win the game, the player of the game is probably going to be one of either Wilkins or Lawrence on the defensive line.
I think an argument could be made that was the case against Auburn. I know you got Bryant with the 2 rushing touchdowns and made some really big third down throws, but you got to give that MVP award to the pass rush, I think, and I agree. We're going to see the same thing in my mind. If Clemson wins this game, it's going to be very much like the LSU Louisville game we saw last year. If Louisville wins this game, I think it's a lot like the Louisville-Clemson game we saw last year. I'm going to go first on my scores just so people don't think that I copy you because we generally pick the same teams. I like Clemson in this game, and I like it pretty big. Give me 40-20 Clemson.
Wow. Man, going bold. I don't like Clemson quite as much, but I still like them. I think Clemson wins this 27-17.
27-17 would mean that Lamar Jackson really got bottled up. And I'm picking 20, you're picking 17. I think it's, to me, I think one of those situations where Lamar Jackson has so much on his shoulders, which is kind of underselling Malik Williams a little bit, who sort of went off last week against North Carolina. I do think, though, like you said, it's a little unfair. Lamar Jackson touches the ball every play. He's generally their leading rusher, obviously all the passing yards. And I think kind of like we talked about last season at the end of the year with Nick Fitzgerald at Mississippi State, there's so much riding on his shoulders that when it breaks down, it has the potential to really break down, and that's what we saw against LSU. Take that with a grain of salt. I mean, obviously, he's such a special player that he can also show up every week in and week out. So he might make fools out of both of us. And again, early in the year, that's certainly possible. We have no data to go on. It's so frustrating. So far, our gut's been great, but I feel a lot better when I can make a prediction about a game and I can point to not only a computer model that we produce, but just sound logic based on common opponents or some teams they've played with some substance before. But I like Clemson in this game. I still don't know what they got at quarterback, but like you, I feel good about their defense. All right, so that's going to wrap up Louisville and Clemson for us. We had to step outside of the SEC for this one because there's such a light slate this week in the SEC. Y'all, if you're loving this show, loving what we're doing on this channel, please give us a thumbs up. Give us a comment here or there. Let us know what your score prediction is on this or any of the other games we're doing. If you hate what we're saying, give us a thumbs down. That's fine too, but if you give us a thumbs down, man, have the confidence to also give us a post and tell us what we got wrong so we can at least defend ourselves in the comments. We'd love to do that. Anyway, thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.